elected?
I'm almost still young now.
You had to be under 35?
That's right.
Yes, you were under 35, okay. And it's an interesting organisation because it's got academics, obviously, predominantly. I think somewhere in the region of 40% of them are women. So the balance is getting there, not quite there yet. And lay people, I don't know, what is it, about 20% lay people? Yeah, okay. Right. What else can I say?
Feel free to say that I'm sitting to the left of Craig again. I quite like that, actually.
You're sitting to the left?
See how long that stays the case.
You feel free to swap if your positions change. Well, when we first, as a branch, started thinking about speakers and speaking on this particular topic, I approached Andrew Wilson, who's the chair of the commission, the Scottish Economic Growth Commission, and he said, I don't think I'll be able to make it. I said, well, why don't you send a young Turk? And you must have people in your organisation who need to cut their teeth. He said, I'll do better than that. I'll get to Professor Docherty. And he'll be able to come in his carpet slippers because he lives very close to the hub. So, next door. Yes, literally next door. Okay, I think we'll start off, Craig, if you want to set going.
Yeah. So, I'd like to start just by getting a lay of the room. How many of you here are intending to go to at least one of the National Assemblies over the next few weeks? Yeah, that's good. How many of you would have liked to go but couldn't because either tickets were sold out or they are restricted to SNP members, so you couldn't go? Right, that's excellent as well. Because we've got a few audiences here that we're going to be speaking to. A lot of what we're going to be speaking to tonight is really directed at the folk who are going to be at the National Assemblies, because we want to set a tone. Discussion. I want to start off the discussion on this is the question of currency. That was the big question that hit us in the last campaign. It's the one we've all wrestled with since, and to me it's the one that you do need to get right before you can get everything else right. There are essentially 4 very broad options that are available to us, and even then 2 of them we can park. The first one being the currency union that we talked about in the last campaign. That one can be vetoed by the UK government. It was vetoed in the last referendum. And if we go into another campaign, promising things that the other side can veto, there's a name for that kind of campaign. It's called losing. So whenever we're talking about any policy, if we're giving away vetoes to the other side, really think again on that point. The second one, the euro. Now, a lot of people, there's probably quite a few people in here who would like to see Scotland join the euro, especially if you want an independent Scotland in the EU, being an EU member in the way that the UK never really was. Signing up to join the euro could be a big statement of intent that way. But entering the euro is an involved process. It takes a few years to do it. It actually involves having your own currency first, and then linking it to the networks and integrating yourself that way. So even if that's the goal, on day one of independence, we're not going to be a Eurozone member. So that option's out as well. That just leaves two more. The policy that the Growth Commission are proposing, which is sterlingisation, using the pound unofficially, and our plan, which is to launch our own currency by day one of independence. Well, what's the difference? Right now, the Bank of England's making decisions on interest rates, and it's doing it for the whole of the UK sterling zone. You can argue saying, well, London's more important than anywhere else, so that's where the attention's focusing. But you know, on paper, it should be considering the economy of the entire UK when it's making its decisions. If there was a currency union, then Scotland would have a dedicated member on the Bank of England's board, speaking directly for Scotland's interests. If we had our own currency, you know, Scotland would have its own central bank, and it would be making its own decisions for the economy of Scotland. Under sterlingisation, though, it's a bit different. The Bank of England still is making all the decisions for interest rates, but now it's not making any decisions with a view of Scotland. It's not obliged to consider Scotland's economy when it's making these decisions. If Scotland's in a recession and the UK is in a boom time, the Bank of England might want to jack interest rates up to calm down their economy. The effect on that in Scotland would be to plunge us even deeper into a recession. The same as the other way around. If there's a recession in London and they reduce interest rates to stimulate the economy, it could cause Scotland's economy to overheat. There are countries that do this. I mean, Panama, Ecuador use the dollar, Montenegro uses the euro, Liechtenstein uses the Swiss franc. Big difference here, though, is those countries are not more than about 1% of the GDP of the currency zone that they're using. Scotland's about 8% of the GDP of the sterling zone. So if you're removing 8% of your economy from your decisions, it could introduce instabilities into your model. This has not been tried, not been tested in a country of Scotland's relative size before. So we'd really be going into unknown territory if we did this. I have another issue with the kind of timings that the Growth Commission put out as well. They have said that this would be a temporary thing, although it's not a strict timeline. Our plan to launch a currency would start pretty much the day after a referendum. We would start building the IT systems, the bank accounts, start dual pricing all of our shops, start offering people to convert their savings over a 3-year period between the referendum and Independence Day. On Independence Day, the Scottish currency would become the legal tender of Scotland, and politics would resume from then on. Very quickly summarise the Growth Commission's point of view. They would have their transition period, Scotland would become independent. You would then be looking at the 6 tests that they've laid out that you would need to pass before you could create your own currency. I saw that and I was reminded of Gordon Brown's 5 tests that he used to stop the UK entering the euro. If, you know, one of the tests that they put down, the one on deficit reduction, Growth Commission projects that could take about 10 years to pass. So let's take that, we'll say 10 years of passing the tests. Once you've done that, you've then got to pass legislation. For something as big as a currency change, you're actually talking a constitutional amendment. That means a supermajority in your parliament, probably means a referendum, the way Ireland just has done to change their constitution. That could take a year or 2 to arrange. And then you've got to go through the 3-year process of launching your own currency. What I'm saying is, if Scotland had a referendum in 2021 following this timeline, it would be 2039 before Scotland had its own currency. I'll be 55 then.
Percentage scored negative because relative to the elderly, relative to the young, just watching bigger screens. Because the more of that stuff that we actually leave up there, that's where that guy that did the Better Together attack the fears of the elderly.
Yeah.
The wrong will go for them, make them so terrified they will go for the status quo, and it worked. And it's so brilliant. I mean, you have confidence in Geneva. Look at me.
Well, as I said, this to me is the most important policy to get right, because one of the principles that Commonweal lays down when we're planning our policies for independence is a principle we call the future neutral approach. What we want to do is, at the point of independence, Scotland should then be able to have the first independent general election in Scotland, and you should be able to go to all of the parties and read their manifestos, and every one of them should be equally viable. Whether it's the SNP manifesto, the Green manifesto, the Tory manifesto, should be possible to implement in an independent Scotland. That's the most democratic way of doing it. If we go into independence kind of locking ourselves into policies that aren't easy to change, that take years, decades to change, that locks us into a particular vision of the future. Even if we agree with that future, I don't think that's the most democratic way of doing it. And anyway, why I call this the most important policy in the document is, if you happen to agree with everything else in the Growth Commission's report, you can still do it with your own currency. If you're sterlingised, there's a lot of stuff you can't do. So just to go through a couple of the other policies that we might want to discuss in the Q&A, one of the things that caught my eye in the Growth Commission's report was the idea that Scotland should effectively copy and paste the UK's tax code and its financial regulations into an independent Scotland, and that it should keep maintaining some sort of harmonisation with the UK's financial regulations. Those regulations weren't sufficient to prevent the 2008 crash. We recently saw a couple of weeks ago, we had the case of RBS, who during the boom time was noticing that some of its customers that it was giving loans, business loans to, their offices, their businesses, the value of that property was increasing faster than the profit they were getting from the loans. So they deliberately bankrupted their customers to seize their assets. The financial regulators just a couple of weeks ago said, yeah, that's abhorrent, but we don't have the powers to punish them. We can't do that in independent Scotland. I hope we can really go further, really take the opportunity of independence to think about these regulations in a better way, instead of just copy-pasting the past. One of the implications of not having your own currency is that Scotland would be forced to borrow the sterling it needs for the economy probably from the City of London again. These financial institutions may not demand just interest on the loans, they may demand conditions like imposing austerity, like demanding that Scotland cuts its public sector wage bill, or demanding that Scotland opens up its public services like the NHS to private competition. These are things that financiers have demanded of governments when they went to them looking for money. Perhaps more seriously, even if that doesn't happen, if there's a financial crash in London, there's a real possibility that they would not have any money to loan to Scotland. So Scotland could have a liquidity crisis and be dragged into that London crash, despite it having nothing to do with us and with no ability to avoid it. The problem with sterlingisation, as I say, it takes years to set up your own currency. It's not suited for rapid emergency change in crises like these. One of the other big issues I found in there was the concept of the annual solidarity payment. This is a payment to the rest of the UK. It's made up of a few different things. There was £1 billion a year for shared infrastructure, right? Buying services from the UK for various things until Scotland has set up its own institutions. Personally, the Commonweal approach would be to build these institutions in Scotland where possible, and instead of buying services from the UK, if we want to cooperate, then we do so on the basis of two independent government departments cooperating. Doing it this way also means that we have jobs in Scotland rather than keeping them down in London, so there's a financial and an economic benefit to that. There's also a £3 billion a year bill to pay for UK debt interest, so that's Scotland's historic share of debt, despite the acknowledgement that Scotland actually has no obligation to pay that debt. The UK would be the continuing state. It would keep all of the UK's debt. This is something that the UK government acknowledged. If there is some sort of debt and asset settlement, then our plan would be, instead of paying this debt interest, simply work out how much we owe, borrow it if we have to, pay it in one lump sum, and then the obligation is gone. We've settled our bill. That way you don't get into political fights down the line when someone wants to change that number. The one that really struck me though, I really hope Iain can maybe talk about this one, because it was a bizarre one to me. Scotland's entire foreign aid budget of £1.3 billion a year would be given to the UK, and they would spend it in foreign aid as they like. Yeah.
You don't actually say that.
That was definitely the impression I got from it. So I hope you can clarify it. If I've got this wrong, please pull this one out for me. Because I can definitely see a situation, if this is the case, of maybe there being some humanitarian crisis that Scotland takes the side of, and then we find out that Scotland's aid is being used to fund the side that's caused this crisis. That's not a good situation to be in. On a more philosophical point, I do want to get away from this obsession that we always have with economic growth and deficit and debt. We've just had Gers out on Wednesday and we went through that whole rigmarole again. And again, if you don't have your own currency, you do have to pay very close attention to your national deficit, because you have to borrow the money to make up the shortfall. If you do have your own currency, you get to look at things in a broader view. There's a link between your national deficit, your trade deficit, your public deficit. Right? It all sums to zero. So if the national deficit is reduced, if austerity reduces the deficit as the UK has done, what happens is your deficit goes up. If the government sells off healthcare, for instance, you need to buy health insurance. So there's no wonder, well, that's not quite happened in the UK yet. Other services have been sold off and have been replaced with private services. It's no wonder that in the UK, the private debt burden, household debt, is at a record high. Consumer spending is decreasing because, you know, people, they're paying their rent, their gas bill, their commute, and their credit card bill, and they've got no money left over to buy stuff. I would like to take a more holistic approach to the economy. Instead of narrowing in on GDP and growth, actually look at sustainability. Look at the environmental impact we're having on Scotland and the wider world. Look at inclusion. The Scottish Government has a metric called inclusive growth. Even that, you know, if your economy is growing and it all goes to the top 1%, as it often does, that's terrible. But what about the other way? What happens if there's a recession and that impacts the poor more than it impacts the rich? So we're not getting richer when the economy grows, but we're getting poorer when the economy shrinks. The inclusion has to work on all sides of the economy. So I would want to look at inclusion and inequality rather than growth. And we need to look at well-being. Well-being and happiness in the society, because what does it matter what shape or size your economy is if we're all miserable? There's a great comic that goes around the internet. It's a guy in a ragged business suit, sort of huddled around a campfire. There's a burning city in the background, and he's saying, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So, yeah, I'm going to round up here. We now have at least two detailed prospectuses for independence. We've got common rules, we've got the growth commissions, and I hope we can, over the course of the Q&A, we can tease out a few more details about that. And for the folk who are going to the National Assemblies, I hope this can set the tone for the discussions you want to have there. We've got our papers online, we're producing films and other information that I hope you can pick up and watch as well. As I said, I am really keen to push this future neutral approach to independence. So even if you don't agree with the common rule view, you know, let's try and create an independence that can suit whatever view that we want to go to.
You sense that the political parties will all participate in that? Will they know that Tories just seem to want to destroy them from the
Well, don't vote for them. I know, we want to set it up so that they can participate. If they don't want to, that's their choice.
just in the sense that all want to cover the Labour seems to be the direction that just want to keep our
Scottish politics to a great degree is paralysed around the constitutional question at the moment. Maybe after independence we get a reset and a realignment.
David, can I ask you to try and keep the questions until he's finished his spiel?
So just last slide anyway. As I say, our website, allofusfirst.org, you can download all the policy papers. I also have copies of our book, How to Start a New Country. If you want to buy a copy, I've got some up the back. Give me a shout after the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. I think we'll leave the bulk of the questioning, if we may, until both speakers have spoken. Is that okay? Okay. So now it's Professor Iain Docherty.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and tell you about how the Commission unfolded, which I'll guarantee you is somewhat different from how the media and other people often tell you how it unfolded, particularly those on the unionist side. What I've been asked to do, and what I'd like to do, is tell you a bit about the history of why the Commission came about, because it's really important to understand the discussions that were happening and why we set up the Commission, why the remit is what it is, and then why we came to the decisions that we did. And I'll also tell you at the beginning that there were some quite robust debates. They were debates, not discussions, inside the Commission about all of the key policy recommendations that obviously we are now all chewing over. And we were absolutely of the view that the Commission's report had to stimulate debate. We are not shying away from that. It's great. We welcome constructive criticism, because that's the kind of debate that we need, with emphasis on the constructive. Some of the critique from the other side is not always as constructive as you might like it to be, but I'd echo Craig's call to get involved. If you can get to the National Assemblies and you can take some of the thinking that you've got after tonight and help participate in those debates, all better. So, history of the Commission. Everybody in this room will have had countless debates after September 2014 about what next. Okay, so all of the members of the Commission had those discussions. We had them with each other, because many of us knew each other before the Commission was founded. We had them with colleagues in government, both on the civil service side. We had it with colleagues who are politicians in the government and others. So I'm sure you all recognise the kind of stages of bereavement that we all went through, of grief after 2014, and then we started to think, okay, what do we do next? How do we move forward from this? And something crystallised for me on the, let me get the date right, 24th of March 2016, which in the white paper was set out to be the date when Scotland became independent. I pitched a newspaper article to a broadsheet that shall remain nameless to protect the guilty, to say what an independent Scottish government would do on day one. So what would be in the entry for ministers? It will probably not surprise you to learn that I got a very polite response that said, "No luck. We're going to have about a 4-page feature about why everything's absolutely terrible and that we all dodged a bullet, and isn't it great that we voted no?" Indeed, the Telegraph, a different paper, not the one I mentioned, had a fantastic piece which is well worth reading for an insight into the media of the time. It said, "Imagine the mess that independent Scotland would be in right now on that day." Okay. So we were having these conversations. It was a difficult time, because the no side thought it was in the ascendancy, thought it had won the argument, put everything to bed. But discussions were happening inside government and with people that work with government, with Andrew in particular, between Andrew and the FM, about two things. One of which was, well, okay, we lost the referendum. It's 2016. What are we going to do as a devolved government? What are we going to do to keep the economy developing within the powers that we've got? When those discussions went on. And secondly, there was the debate about, okay, how do we begin the task of re-articulating the economic case for independence? Then another important date occurred, 23rd of June 2016, I remember that when I walked out of my house and I crossed the road to take the kids to school. What did I see at Bearsden Cross traffic lights in the morning? I saw a UK Government Home Office immigration van. And I thought, wow, that really sums up what's about to happen. And of course, we all know what occurred on that evening. And it's fair to say that everything was up in the air from the 24th of June 2016, and it still is, because we still don't know the outcome of the mess that is Brexit that I'll come back to. So in the autumn, the First Minister decided it was time to do something to bring these discussions together, to inform her thinking, party's thinking, about how we might do two things. One, have a short-term plan to grow the economy given where we were, and secondly, to re-articulate the case for independence. And that was our remit, effectively. Now, it's fair to say that the report took longer to produce than we hoped. We nearly published it, I think at least 3 or 4 times. There are 2 reasons why we stopped publishing it 3 or 4 times. One is that we wrote too much. We wrote way too much. And we had a task which was about trying to condense it into something that people would read, which we got halfway towards. And we also thought about what the structure of the report would need to be and how we could time it so that its objective to stimulate the debate would actually work. And because of Brexit, and because, you know, just when you think things couldn't get more ludicrous, another event would come along, and we thought it's still not the right time to land this, and of course the quarterly economic statistics would be updated and we'd have to rewrite bits of the report. And we got ourselves into a position where 3 or 4 times we were nearly ready to publish, but we didn't. But eventually, as you know, we did. Now, I think the night before we published the report, I had a conversation with Andrew, and I said, I'm really not sure how this is going to land. I'm really worried about it, because this is pretty hardcore Scandi social democracy. That's what I think it is. Because I'm a pretty hardcore Scandinavian social democrat. Right? So that's me speaking as an individual and a commissioner. That's my kind of perspective on what I would call political economy. Because you can't actually separate economic decisions from political ones. Okay, so again, you know, people out there have different views about labels that they like to attach to what the Commission does. And we're all individuals and we all have different personal views on some of the nuance, etc., but it's me that's speaking to you tonight. So I think it's fairly mainstream, Scandi type politics. And there's also a reason why we structured the report in the way that we did. You'll notice that the media in particular has hardly referenced Part A at the beginning, which is what we call a situation analysis, a statement of what the Commission thinks the issues are. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about how we got to that bit and then come on to the individual policy choices which Craig's alluded to, and then we can have a discussion about those. So let's think about the economic case for the Union, which was so strong in March 2016 that it was running the debate. Well, the economic case for the Union is the fiscal transfer. Barnett. That's it. Right? There is no other economic case for the Union. Nobody stands up and says it makes Scotland more competitive, it means we've got a better and more resilient industrial structure, it doesn't serve wages, it's nothing. It's all about the fiscal transfer. And you saw that as union dividend, or whatever they want to call it. Okay. Pooling and sharing, as a well-known former Prime Minister likes to call it. Now, to be fair, there is probably an argument to be made that the Barnett formula manages short-term fiscal risk. So it smooths out some of the inevitable variations in annual budgets. But that's probably about it. Okay? And in Part A of the report, we were really keen to stake out our collective view in the Commission about what the problem that Scotland in 2018 finds itself in. And we think of them as some inconvenient truths for unionists. But again, I think it's important that you understand where our perspective on all this is. So, the UK is a phenomenally unequal place. It's spatially unequal between regions, between cities, towns. It's now phenomenally unequal between generations, with real long-term implications, particularly the way the housing market works. And it's phenomenally unequal in terms of the range of income levels of individuals. and all of the impacts that that has on a cohesive society. Okay. I'm always at this point, and we nearly, I think, put this in the report, but couldn't find a decent enough image. Tony Benn, when he was a cabinet minister in the 60s or 70s in his office, used to have a map of the UK on his wall that he turned upside down. And he said that that was to remind him every day he was at work that his job was to distribute wealth from south to north. Okay? That hasn't worked. It doesn't work. Because the UK's political economy does not pool and share opportunity. What we've evolved is a policy-making system that says, here's the core in London and the South East. It's too big to fail, and the regions can go fly. Right? That's pretty much how UK political economy works. Population growth and migration in Scotland is a perfect example of this. So you will often see when it's Gers time, there will be unionist critique of Scotland's ageing population, why population is aging faster than the UK, and what that means for the structure of the economy. And their solution is, isn't it great you've got the fiscal transfer, and you can only afford to deal with the problem because of that? Whereas, of course, the correct answer is, well, no, let's fix the problem. Let's have some powers over migration and the structure of the macroeconomy to help do something different. And that's why, in part, at the beginning of the report, and in fact throughout, we focus so much on population and migration as a positive element of the debate, and we think it's so important that we don't let that debate get captured by others with a different agenda. So we've got an economic system which locks in relative decline everywhere that's not in the core. And there's a fantastic phrase in a book written by a couple of researchers, I think at the LSE at the time, it's 25 years old now, Joe Merkins and others, I can't remember the co-authors, but if they describe the political purpose of the Barnett formula as being a kind of sedative. So what they offer from the UK to the devolved nations is that we give you this fiscal transfer every year and we'll kill you with the kindness of it. Because what it does is it stops us addressing the first principles questions about why the economy looks like it does, and why it doesn't look better, and why we don't emulate the success of the countries that we write about in the report. Okay, so that's to give you a flavour of our general perspective on where we are. So at the front end of the report we've got a situation analysis that says all of that. You know, Scotland's an economic region of a large economy called the UK. The UK is grossly unequal between places, between generations, between individuals. You know, one of the phrases in the media that absolutely drives me nuts is when you hear people accidentally talk about the UK being the 6th or 7th richest country in the world. No, it's not. It's the 6th or 7th, depending on the exchange rate. Largest economy in the world, but in per capita GDP terms, and this is something in Craig's work I think that you're really correct to highlight. In GDP per capita terms, and therefore in real wages and real living standards, it's absolutely mundane in its performance. It's down to something like 27th, 28th, I think, in most league tables. Okay? Real wages are depressed, etc., etc. That means that well-being of all of us is not nearly where it should be. And of course, partly because of that, and think about the map that we've all seen about how different places voted in the Brexit referendum, this dysfunctional political economy is about to embark on a massive nationalist tantrum called Brexit that will make everything worse. Every single serious analysis, not just about the overall GDP loss to the UK, but says it will be highly differential between regions, and that the north of England in particular is going to be hit extraordinarily badly by Brexit, right? So, we say the economic case for the Union is unsustainable. Fabulous quote, as I've made aware of recently, by the late Lord Ralph Dahrendorf, who was a leading intellectual figure of the Labour Party and then I think actually the SDP in the 70s and 80s, and he described British politics as being focused on offering a better version of yesterday. That's exactly what the current structure of the political economy of Britain and the fiscal transfer that underpins it does. Okay, it says, there, it's fine. It'll all be like it was yesterday because we'll give you some more cash. Interesting thought experiment. And this is particularly important for those of you who read highly numerate critiques from the unionist side of some of our work, which assumes that the status quo is resilient and likes to do 25-year point forecasts about what the status quo will be like. If Brexit turns out to be anything like most of the mainstream economic analysis of how it will affect different regions, particularly of England, will there be anything that looks like a Barnett formula in 5 years, let alone 25 years? I don't think there will be. Okay? So even a better version of yesterday is optimistic. So, Sustainable Growth Commission. The clue is in the name. The current model is not sustainable. And that was our starting point. Now, we deliberately set out to make or to find a set of recommendations after debate, it's probably more accurate, that says we'll take a pragmatic, mainstream view using the kinds of policy approaches and policy tools that other generally social democratic type countries use to show that Scotland can be independent and therefore become sustainable in a long-term political sense. And that's important to say. Yes, a lot of our assumptions are deliberately conservative with a small c. Because in our kind of report, they have to be. If we make assumptions that we can't be as sure as possible on from the evidence, then politically we'd have got all kinds of noise and all kinds of critique. They would have undermined the debate we want to have about let's move to a more sustainable place. Okay, so I think it's important to say that there's a reason why we've been cautious. Because I think it's the right posture to adopt. Secondly, and this is something that I think is very important and is not debated very much, is that independence for Scotland is a transition, and a difficult transition. It's one that we want, and to me it's one that we have to have if we're going to make the economy sustainable for the long term and to achieve the wider social goals that we want to have from the fruits of that economy. But managing transitions is not easy. And managing transitions is about understanding risks and opportunities and then having a democratic debate about how we balance them. And I think this is where the really interesting kind of link between Craig and our points of view comes into play. So we're transitioning. In fact, it's the latest stage of Scotland as an economy's transition from a heavily industrialised, fairly monocultural economic region of a big economy into a functioning, diverse, prosperous, autonomous economy. And we all know the advantages of that. That's why we support independence, okay? But we have to understand that that's a transition, and it is hard, and it requires work to get it to work. So, if, for example, you think, well, let's go to the currency test. See, I've gone, how many minutes was that? And I haven't said currency yet. I was going to try and get further, but I didn't. I failed. If you think, and so the 6 tests, I mean, we debated this at length. Because we had a whole set of debates about currency. Because currency is a choice, right? There's more than one plausible policy, currency posture for Scotland, right? As I think we said a few minutes ago. We could realistically choose from 3 or 4 positions. I'm going to really radical here, right, and say that if I'm in a meeting in this hall in 25 years' time looking back on how it all went right, I'd quite like us to be in the euro. And I know the economic literature about the alleged disadvantages about being a member of the euro versus having a free-floating currency. And if you look at Swedish economic literature, there's lots of this stuff. But, you know, I'm enough of a believer in the economic project that I think I'd love us to get to that position where we could make that positive choice. There are lots of things we could do. But we came up with a view on what our currency recommendation was on the 6 tests to make it credible and to make it a transition that the institutions that we create would be able to manage and not get wrong. And there are different plausible and defensible views about whether we're too timid, frankly. And Andrew himself has said, okay, that's a fair critique. If you think we are too timid with the tests, and our view on the transition to a floating currency, tell us how to make it happen faster. Show us what policy levers and interventions we've not got we should use and how the institutions that we recommend could pool them to make it happen faster. So one thing I'll say to you absolutely is that we did not design the test to stop it happening, categorically. Okay? And we know that the comparison with Brown and the euro was unhelpful because he clearly did do that. Okay? And that's a fair point, and that's one that we would push back on. So, probably time for me to sit down and get the Q&A going. I haven't talked about the politics of it all yet, but I'll do that before I do sit down. I do come from a business school where people do this thing called management, and it's a truism in change management that convincing people that moving from A to B is a good thing is the easy part. Easy to say to people, that's better over there than what you've got now. Okay? The really hard part is convincing people that moving from A to B is worth the effort. And that's where lots of transitions and change management processes break down. Okay, and I think my personal view about this is that independence of Scotland is the most important change management task we've got in how we move the Scottish economy and society away from the last vestiges of that regionalised, branch plant, non-diverse, non-creative history that we had towards being more like the exemplar countries that we write about in the report. Now, in 2014, looking at the evidence, we probably convinced enough people that an independent Scotland was a good idea. What we did not do, and why no won the referendum, was that we did not convince the majority of people that it was worth the effort. And what our Commission's report is designed to do is to show that the effort is worth it and that we can do it in the real world as we find it and not as we would like it to be. And so if the work that we've done and the debate that we've generated helps us to get further towards that goal, that would be great, and that's what the Commissioners set out to do. Thank you very much.
Question. Can you direct your questions to the Chair? Any questions? Hang on. Let's see. No woman with a question. That's a kind of
That's coming.
You would go. Even husband, yes.
I'm maybe being naive and simplistic here, but my worry, if we stick with sterilisation, I nearly said sterilisation, sterilisation,
The snip.
knowing the feeling, or the feeling that I perceive from south of the border, is that they may take it out on us if we get our independence. Will they help us to flourish in Scotland, or will they put barriers in our way to becoming successful if they are actually holding some of the purse?
Can be Gary the second time round.
Sorry?
It can be Gary Steve the second time
Yes.
round. They'll try whatever they can.
Yes,
to
that's my worry. That if we stay with sterilisation.
Any comments?
Personally, I'm not quite sure if that would feel its impact through the currency plan in this sense, because that, you know, if we've got our own currency, you know, we're shielded against it. If even under sterlingisation, you know, Scotland's just borrowing money from the markets, so even if you're interacting with the Bank of England through this process, the Bank of England is functionally independent from the government. So Westminster couldn't impose anything on the Bank of England without infringing on that independence. So I'm not quite sure if it would manifest through that angle.
Sterling's a freely tradable international reserve currency. You know, you have to, and I think this is where the insight in the debate between these two positions is, right? Which of these choices that we take to make this transition happen is about how we balance risk and opportunities, right? And there will be more than one valid view on what the balance of those risks and opportunities is. Our view is that the risks of moving straight to a floating currency, and these may well just be perceived risks out there rather than real ones, but perception is real in terms of currency risk generally in lots of different fields, but also in terms of the kinds of stuff you saw a bit of in 2014 about pensions and mortgages and all the rest of it. That perceived risk is real. Right? I don't personally think the risk of using a tradable international currency for a defined period of time, if we get the tests right, is as remotely material. You may have a different view. Craig, I think, has got a different view. That's
Although
a fair debate to have.
Even within that, I can see a case for, right, during the transition period, under our plan, the Scottish currency would be pegged to sterling. You need to do this for the technical reasons of setting up the currency. At the point of independence, it then becomes a political choice. We could move straight to a freely floated currency. Personally, I think that's probably where I would aim, but you could also just as well keep pegged to sterling, or you could peg to the euro or a basket of currencies, and they all have their own policy implications as well. As it's all part of that future neutral thing of, you know, we can take that initial plan and then branch out to many futures.
Can I just say something else about that as well? And it's important to think about how anything that Craig or the Commission or the pro-independence movement puts out is heard in the media. There's upside as well as downside risk to all these things. That means that things could turn out better than we expect rather than worse. You know, and if we're successful in a new autonomous jurisdiction called Scotland in growing the economy more quickly, then these choices get easier. Right? And part of our argument in the Commission report is that there's a fixed institutional capacity to make things happen, particularly in the early days of an independent country, and we really want to focus on improving our growth performance because it'll make these choices easier and make things happen more quickly. Now again, that's our view, and we set out in the report why we think that needs to be the priority. And if you hear Andrew speak at these kind of events, he's absolutely, I mean, he's much more au fait with the inner workings of the financial system, something I try to avoid, I have to say, being a good Scandinavian social democrat, than I am. But he makes some really good points about institutional capacity, and to the new report about, you know, there's a limited amount of expertise to go around. We will have enough, but we need to make sure we absolutely direct it on our priorities. Because if you get that right, and the quicker you grow the economy, the better choices you've got, and the more quickly you can make things happen positively. But these are all upside risks. These things are all possible if we get it right.
Iain.
My question is, why would it take 3 years to set up a Scottish currency? After all, if you look at the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, my understanding is that initially they were going to share the currency, but within about 6 months it became obvious that wasn't going to work, and it didn't take them very long for Slovakia to set up their own currency. Equally, if you think about how quickly the old pound coin disappeared and the new pound coin came, or the old paper pound, £5 and £10 disappeared and the plastic ones came in, I don't see why it's going to take 3 years to set up.
So I'll run through the process chronologically. Part of the issue is we're 30 years on from a lot of the transition from the post-Soviet era, and we've actually just become a much more digitised, IT-reliant society, and that actually makes things a bit trickier. Our process, year one, you would launch the currency as a digital token, right? Just to allow the IT systems to have a marker that they can use. The banks can then start upgrading all their systems and their payment methods, because things like BACS, which you use to transfer money in the UK, that's purely a sterling system. So you need a different different payment system, a faster and more efficient one, to use the Scottish currency. You then give people the opportunity to open new bank accounts, because again, your sterling bank account doesn't accept foreign currencies. If you take dollars into the bank, it gets converted into sterling and then put into your account. I think there's one, maybe two banks now in Britain that offer multi-currency accounts. They're not common. Shops start dual pricing. You then, as the central bank starts building up, and this is a big difference Scotland has compared to the Soviet countries. A lot of these countries had a federal banking system that could just become a central bank. Scotland doesn't. It'd have to set one up. It's a recruitment issue more than anything else. They can have their shiny glass and steel towers later. Once the central bank is up and running, it can start producing Scottish currency. If you want to convert your savings, you go to your retail bank or potentially directly to the central bank and sell your sterling one-to-one for Scottish currency. This takes you up to the end of year 2. Year 3, the Scottish Government's systems for tax and social security have been upgraded by this point. So devolved tax, devolved social securities you can start paying in the Scottish currency. It's at this point, once you've had a public design contest to design the notes and the coins, and even the name of the currency, because not everyone wants to keep the pound. So the pound Scots, I get a lot of blowback whenever I mention that name. Whatever you want to call it, the Merc, the unicorn, we have that discussion. But once you've decided the shape and size of the notes and coins, that's when you do the upgrades for your vending machines and your IT systems, and you commission Delarue, the Royal Mint, or whatever other company to produce the physical currency. That process takes about 6 months. That comes right at the end. But this process is actually modelled on the way the euro was set up. It was actually when we wrote a paper in 2016 outlining Scotland's currency options. And we got a phone call the week after from a guy who lives over in Ayr, Peter Ryan, who helped me with this recent paper. Says, it looks like you want to set up a new currency. I know a little bit about that. I helped with the euro. He helped set up some of the IT systems. So we've very much modelled that process on the way the euro was set up. The major difference, actually, except for scale, is that when the euro was setting up, if you took your francs to convert to euros, those francs were disappeared. They ceased to exist. The sterling would still exist in an independent Scotland. So the central bank could actually just claim that sterling and use it as part of the foreign currency reserve. That's a bit of an advantage we have. So yeah, it's a fairly long technical process, but that's what we think we need to do to get it right.
I would have thought that provided you made one Scots pound equal in value to a pound sterling, that the whole process could be much expedited, because with the complication with the euro was that you had all the different values of all the different currencies coming into one. But if you just make it one-to-one initially, then your IT systems, your backs, all the bank accounts become much simpler.
Becomes simpler to understand in an outward view, but the technical side still has to happen.
And I'm not a technological.
Yeah, but that's for the bankers to sort out. That's the beauty of it. That all happens behind the curtain. But you're right, this gradual transition, you might find that Scottish currency does start to, at least digitally, starts to circulate before the 3 years, and we become a kind of dual currency nation for a while. We're kind of already used to that with our different £10 notes.
Well, certainly, I was in business. I had a shop at the time that decimalisation happened, and it was amazing how quickly the transformation was made.
Well, this is the thing. A lot of folk here who remember decimalisation have went through a process, not identical but similar. In fact, no matter what we call the currency, eventually, it's going to be easier than decimalisation, because no matter what we call the currency, I bet you there's still going to be 100 sturgeons to the salmon. We're not bringing back the shilling. Post-Brexit UK, I don't know, maybe. There's talk of that, isn't there?
Nothing would surprise me anymore. Didn't you?
No. I just wondered, since Scotland voted to remain, majority voted for remain in the Brexit referendum, I wonder, has it been considered that Scotland, an independent Scotland, would rejoin the European community?
This, again, is part of the whole future neutral discussion. That's something that we need to do in a way that discussion can happen. By one of the other issues I have with the sterlingisation plan is that in order to be an EU member, you have to have a central bank. And it needs to be a fully functional central bank operating on EU rules, so sterlingisation might make that process harder. For my part, I think just with the timing of Brexit now, we're not going to get independence before B-Day next March. I love that phrase. Don't know why more people aren't using it. I think there's going to be a gap in our EU membership. But I do hope that we can get our independence before Prime Minister Rees-Mogg starts slashing all the regulations and makes it even harder to get back in, and we can make that transition as smooth as possible. If you've got any comments on that?
It's probably just useful to say that we could have written equally, if not longer, report on Brexit. We still don't know which kind of Brexit we're going to get, and therefore what kind of future options we're going to have. So we tried not to say anything that would have very quickly become out of date, very quickly being the following morning's news cycle. For what it's worth, I think I said earlier on, I'm strongly pro-European, to the extent that that probably flavours my personal views on the ultimate currency endgame for Scotland, because after all it's a political economy, and the euro isn't much of a problem to small northern European productive states, of course. So I'm sure that different people in the Commission will have different views on that. We argued them out in terms of coming up with what we thought was the realistic currency plan for the world as we found it, not as we'd like it to be. But if you're asking me how would I vote in any subsequent referendum, yes, I'd love us to move back to full membership of the EU as quickly as possible.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I've got a question that's a close question actually for Iain. So please don't be Corbynist about this. It should be simple to answer. It's not going to be difficult to answer. Since you're closer to the First Minister's ear on economics than we are, perhaps through Andrew, simple question, because we're going to be focusing on currency here. Is it the case that the First Minister wants to know when she announces IndyRef 2 what the prospective decision or recommendation is going to be for the currency question, because she'll be asked that straight away? Or is it the case that, for me, for example, I would see an 18-month period after the first day of independence, after the 19th of September, whatever it will be, 18 months before we set up an independent state. That gives us a series, 18-month series of rolling referenda perhaps, every 3 months perhaps, maybe initially currency, the first one in 3 months for example, something else 3 months later, something. People might lose interest, but that doesn't matter. It's up to them to decide what kind of country they want to form through independence. Is Nicola Sturgeon going to be amenable to saying that, a bit like Alex Salmond was first time around, or is she going to have to say, listen, I'm going to be nailed on this straight away, so we're going to nail our colours to the mast, therefore I have to know what the decision is before I can even announce IndyRef 2? Is that why she's scared to go there until she's sure?
Good question. Good question. I don't know. I've spoken to the First Minister once since the report was published, where a group of us that were available went to talk with her about the report. I don't want to put words in her mouth. We've written a report that sets out our recommendations that we think are the sensible pathways to achieve what we want to see. She's been pretty forthright in terms of how the SNP will debate that through the National Assemblies. And I presume that will then come to conference eventually for some kind of formal policy decision. It's 15 years, I think, since I've actually been active in the party in a political sense, so forgive my rustiness for knowing how these mechanisms work these days. I don't want to put words in her mouth. I'm sure she understands the issues. I'm sure she understands that there's more than one plausible position for us to be in. I've known the First Minister for 20 years now. I always like to remind her that I was only in second year at university when I first met her at Hustings in the 1992 general election, when she was going between public meetings and sitting our law finals. So that's how long I've known her for. I don't think she's somebody that ever gets scared. I think she's an immensely astute student of the long game. And at the risk of straying into the politics, which is not something I particularly want to do, when your opponent is busy hanging themselves, you feed them more rope. And also, to be honest, who knows what kind of Brexit-inspired political crisis we're going to have, because there will be one. And it will probably either be in October, probably during the party conference season, or it will be at some point between January and March. And any pragmatic leader of a government who has the interests of their electorate and citizens at heart would want to be as flexible and keep as many options open as possible. So I think she's doing exactly the right thing in waiting and seeing until something crystallises. And as I say, she's an incredible student of the long game, and I'm sure she has spent so much time thinking through what those moments of crystallisation might be, and that she knows how she's going to act. But can I tell you what she's thinking about what they are? I'm sorry, I can't.
So if that's the case, we don't have to jump now to make a decision about currency. We should educate ourselves to the options and be ready to jump when the question is asked.
So we absolutely should. And I mean, I'm tempted to say, and this is back to the structure of the report, if we spent as much time talking about the structural problems of the political economy we find ourselves in, and why we need to get out of it to make our society and economy sustainable in terms of better productivity, better inclusion, doing something about the mix of the population. If we spent as much effort debating that as we do currency, we'd probably be in a much better place. Not just in terms of general understanding about what the issues are, but also to be ready to fight another referendum where the economy will be the battleground again. I really would encourage you to think about why we wrote the report in the order we did. Look at the front end and look at what it says.
David.
I think it ties a wee bit to what you said, which is a very important thing, that how do you persuade people that it's actually not making the effort. This is an anecdote purely and simply a little Austrian lady who approached us up Stewart Street in Mulgai just before the referendum, she was a really genuinely lovely old lady. She must have been touching 90s. And she said she was pretty much sure she was going to vote no in the thing, but she wanted to give us a chance to sort of maybe advise us. She had started off with her money, her savings in Deutschmarks, which then were converted forcibly into the Reichmarks. Then she went to Deutschmarks, but that was forcibly because she was trying to escape from the Nazis and the terrible things happening there. So she ended up in France, converted to the euro, and then she ended up coming to the UK because she had family here and she was getting elderly. And with each of these transitions, she lost quite substantial sums of money on her savings. And this was all to do with this currency question. And of course we couldn't give her an assurance one way or the other, but all we could say was, A, your pensions are going to be secure because that's all tied to England, and that we would do everything to sort of match the values so that the pound would be matched. And she was wise enough and intelligent enough to get that. So she took her wee blue book and she promised faithfully she would read the book and she would make her decision with some information. That comes back to this whole thing about information, 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 but it has to be at a level that people on the ground floor are going to take on board and going to be interested in reading. So that's just a point that if people think their pockets are going to be hurt, they're not really interested if it's short term, medium term. That's of no interest. If it's coming out of their pocket, that's going to sway them. And that's probably where the opposition is going to really face us out on. So.
Commonweal and some of our partner organisations have been doing a lot of focus grouping and polling on attitudes towards independence over the last few months, and we're hoping we can start rolling out some of the conclusions of that as soon as possible. One of the big things, one of the key things that I've found looking through the data, you sort of split everyone up along remember the 10-point scale we had for independence, running from absolutely never to absolutely yes, right? But you've got a segment of the population who, for lack of a better phrase, are flag-waving nationalists. Whether it's a saltire or a Union Jack, they're never going to change their position no matter what. If you're a campaigner on the door and you find one of these people, say thank you, bye, move on to the next one, even if they agree with you, right? No point in talking to them, they're never going to change, right? Half of them you don't want to change. In the middle, you've got the kind of softer pro-independence voters who have been convinced that it's a good idea and are ready to make that leap. You've got the softer no people, Iain was saying, who probably think it might be a good idea but are not yet ready to make that leap. This is the thing that is coming out of these social attitude surveys. These softer no voters look a lot more like yes voters than they do hardcore no voters. That means they're winnable. They're more winnable to our side than our voters are to the other side. Getting it right so that we can bring people with us is going to be the key to winning the next referendum.
But that was better together. When you watch the YouTube video, they are down to the mistake of saying removal.
Yeah.
And that's really battered away at, and they hammered it. And they hammered away right up to the day before the election, or referendum. And that's exactly the point we're making. We need to do exactly that same modelling, but we need to come along with positive messages and really reinforce them. It's a good thing. And again, I totally admire that view that we have to make it clear this is really worth the effort and why. And my very last point on that is we spoke to a number of teenagers who were being unduly influenced by parents and grandparents. And it's something to really tackle them, to show kids that this is your future you're voting for, because there was probably a couple of kids we managed to stop in their tracks before they started to abuse us on the stand by saying, look, you just need to stop and think that the older folk have had all the benefits of Europe and so on, and things are changing, and the arguments are all changing, but at the end of the day you're going to have to live with the result of this. And we did manage to get through a few of these kids, but we needed more reinforcement.
There's been a good shift in the polls among the younger folk. We kind of look at the headline polls and say, oh, nothing much changing. It's about 46% yes, plus or minus 3, and it has been since 2014, which itself is an astounding thing. When you dig into them, I have a paper called The Demographics of Independence, published a couple of months ago, that digs into the sub-demographics on this. When you look at age, younger folk have shifted from about 55% pro-Indy to about 75% pro-Indy. There's a big, older folk are drifting away. There's a big widening generational gap happening in Scotland. So that's something to address.
Yeah, because that goes to 53, there's 77% of the young would definitely say they want to have this whole Brexit thing binned, because it doesn't represent them at all.
I think I'm right to say that if you look at the polling evidence that we've got, you're absolutely right, we know the headline figures haven't changed, but something like a third of people on each side have changed their mind.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly
so the level of churn that's going on out there is extraordinary, actually. And so you've got two kind of movements. So people that have gone no to yes tend to be younger, more female, and higher income.
Yep.
And people that have gone yes to no tend to be older, more male, and lower income. And that tells us something about how the different kinds of kind of flag waving debates are playing out, and how people perceive the messages that the Brexit sides in particular are saying about their own individual lives. Just to promise I wouldn't talk about politics, but I can't resist it now I'm back. This is the first political public meeting I've done in 15 years. It makes me feel really old. This constituency, let's think about what we know about it from how people vote. Right? So it's really cautious. It voted no strongly. It voted remain strongly. There's a lot of people here that we know are on relatively high incomes, but their standard of living is still precarious. And they are just absolutely desperate for it not to go wrong. You have to understand the psychology of that. That's why it's so difficult for people in places like this, that if to get them over that, it's worth the effort, because they immediately think about the risks. You see that in the demographic and the huge chasm we've got now between age groups. But unless we understand the psychology of that and think about why people are making a rational choice, we won't be able to articulate any of these arguments in a way that will really land with them.
Yeah. As you were saying, with the really deep structural problems with the UK economy, you've got people, households with, from an objective point of view, should look pretty well off and earning substantially more than I am, for instance, but almost their entire combined wages go into paying the mortgage, the gas bill and the commute. They've got nothing left over for life. And that's no way to run a country. And
or childcare, which of course we mustn't forget. And we must think about how that resonated in 2014, because that really did land, because it's a serious issue.
Maura, before I bring you in, can I just make a plug for the ambassador scheme? That's the canvassing programme run by McIntyre Kemp of the Business for Scotland. It's raising very much these questions, how you reframe the canvassing, your approach to canvassing on the doorstep in order to take people from that category of vulnerable people, as far as we are concerned, take them over the line and vote for independence. Anyway, Morag.
I'm just wondering how important, when we talk about the pound, for me the pound is an English thing, that is the pound. How important is it that when you change the currency to whatever you change it to, that we actually identify with it as a Scottish currency? We have our own Scottish notes, and so, you know, and there's people on them, we recognise them or we don't sometimes. But I just wonder how important is it that any currency we have actually defines us and that we actually identify with it?
Absolutely crucial, and this is why it's very important that when we are, if we're launching the currency, we have a public contest to design the notes and the coins. It sounds like quite a small thing, but the people, the places, the faces and the themes that you put on your currency really resonate with the idea of what we think of ourselves as a country and the image that we want to project of that country to the world. You know, I could regale you with stories of discussions on this exact thing, of currency designs going really well or going badly or just going weird. The euro is a great example of this one. Right? When the euro was established, there were 7 banknotes. There were 12 founding countries, so they couldn't have one country per banknote. Right? They did decide they wanted to have something that was emblematic of, you know, breaking down the barriers between the countries, so they chose bridges. All these wonderful bridges on the banknotes. But again, they couldn't have one bridge per, you know, founding country. Even if they did, imagine if the UK had been a founding member, would we just accept that Tower Bridge would be our representative bridge? So the EU came up with pretty much the most wonderful EU fudge I've ever seen. They commissioned an architect to design 7 unique bridges that didn't exist. Except, it gets better. A few years ago in the Netherlands, there was an architect commissioned to design a housing estate that was surrounded on 3 sides by a canal. It needed 7 bridges. So he claimed them for the Netherlands. Even the really garish purple suspension bridge on the €500 note. So yes, very important we get our hand into this.
Can I rip up the consensus? Mm-hmm. Can we please stop talking about this?
Yeah.
Right? We need to earn the right to make these choices. Mm-hmm. Right? If we talk about this, okay, it'll be all back to the easy critique of 2014 that we are focusing on things that are flag-waving nationalism and are not real. Now, let's all have fun when we get to that point, but we have to earn the right to make that decision. Mm-hmm. And I come back to think that, you know, we've got so much more work to do before we pay that amount of attention to currency. We've got to get the transition right, we've got to get the institutions right, we've got to know what our priorities are, we've got to articulate that in a way that we can sell it to people so that they understand it's worth the effort. Every single second we talk about this stuff now in 2018 doesn't just stop us talking about what's important, but probably puts people out there off. Let's talk about having a wealthier and fairer society and what we need to do to make it happen. Please let's not talk about symbols and all the fun stuff before we've earned the right to do it.
You give people a wish to try the goods. You do. That's right.
Yes, lady on the phone.
It's just to get your views. Do you have any views on this blockchain voting system? It's just, I think it sounds amazing if it could work, because the amount of people I know, they don't have your normal 9-to-5 jobs and they can't get their polling station on certain days. So I just think it could reach a much wider audience, especially the younger people who are always attached to their phones or whatever.
I have a lot of concerns about this as an idea. You can talk about, you know, the security of the system, and I have done in the past on my blog. the Common Green. You can find an article that goes into this. But even if the system is absolutely perfectly secure, from button press to count, I still have issues with voting away from a ballot booth, because if you've got the app on your phone, well, one, when you downloaded it after you saw that ad on Facebook, was that the real app, or is that a convincing fake? Or even if you eliminate that problem, when you're about to vote, who's standing beside you or behind you telling you how? I've got a big concern with voting away from the anonymity of the ballot box. When it comes right down to it, a secret ballot should be between you and the pencil. And the isolation just of that is a big compelling factor for me. I do see a role for electronic voting, but in a very much more limited sense.
Just in terms of blockchain and related technologies, I mean, there's a lot of central bank, very, very, very clever people's research effort going in to thinking right now about the levels of systemic instability that injecting these things into what we think are stable systems will cause. And I'm with you that I remain, maybe I'm just too old now to be as innovative and creative as I should be, but I think the risks there are substantial. Because you mentioned voting, I'll give you one of my other pet policies that I'm now ever more convinced of than ever, which is that we should have compulsory voting. See, if we want to fix the demographic issue, we need compulsory voting now, right now. We cannot go through what we've seen again in the Brexit referendum and have that level of intergenerational difference reflected in generational 25, 50-year policy decisions. And I know actually that Salmondar, who's First Minister, got close to thinking that he wanted to ask for a compulsory franchise for the NDRF on the basis that he wanted it to be legitimate to make the transition more credible, more legitimate, and he was convinced the turnout will be high enough that that won't be a problem. In a sense, that's what happened. But differential turnout is a real issue now, and the long-term generational inequality impacts of that are phenomenal. Compulsory voting now, please.
Although I'd like to counterpoint that just slightly, because I do have this little thing in the back of my head that says the freedom to vote has to come with the freedom to not vote. I would definitely love to see a none of the above option on your ballot paper, and if that wins, rerun the election with new candidates. Doesn't work for referendums.
There's some good work in Australia as the example of compulsory voting where they do that.
Because our oldest daughter is married in Australia, and I still remember we were there when a vote was taking place. And despite the fact that she comes from a political family and was politically very aware in Scotland, she was asking her husband how she was supposed to vote in this particular election. And then as she went off, finally, how was it to vote? But in Australia, all you have to do is to go in and say, right, I'm registering, that's me voting. You don't even have to put your paper into the ballot box. You can tear it up, do what you like, but you've been there, that's okay.
I absolutely prefer that attitude to people that sit on the sofa. Even if you don't want to vote, go in and void your sheet or put in a blank ballot. Yeah. Much more positive action.
Any more? Iain.
A couple of kind of close questions. Firstly to Craig, you mentioned the issue regarding our debts upon independence.
Yep.
Are you saying that we wouldn't pay them, or that we shouldn't? And secondly to Iain, on the point of the financial frameworks in terms of financial regulations, how the report says take the current ones and kind of transfer them to Scotland, why do you think that's better than actually going with a tougher set of regulations?
Right.
Sorry, it's very dry.
Really interesting though. There are several ways that you can deal with the debt split between countries. The way Czechoslovakia did it was Czechoslovakia dissolved as a country, and two new countries, Czech Republic and the Republic of Slovakia, were created, and they took a proportional share of debts and assets. Right? The other major way of doing it is more like the way the USSR dissolved, where the USSR dissolved, Russia claimed sole successor status to the old state and took on all of the debts. Right? It also kept the USSR's permanent seat on the UN Security Council, something I think the UK might want to keep hold of. This is a position that the UK took, actually. It took the position that it was underwriting all of the UK's debt in the event of independence. Because actually the process of transferring the debt is quite an involved one, especially if you want to actually transfer ownership of things down to the individual bonds. Anyone here have RS&I premium bonds? Yeah. That includes them, right? Countries that have went down this route can get embroiled in decades of sorting this out. For me, the more positive way of doing it, I think the Growth Commission more or less agreed with this on the debt side of things, is the UK takes claim of the debt, also takes claim of all of the UK's mobile assets, most of that's like military equipment and kit and things like that. What I would then say is if Scotland wants a share of those assets, it would mortgage the value of them against a share of debt, and we would build up what we needed. And what I would then say is you tally that up, because there might be stuff in Scotland that the UK wants, and there could be a bit of back and forth there. And if there is a net imbalance, you then write the cheque and you hand it over to whichever side is out of balance.
So we say that you'd have to go through a process of allocating assets as part of the negotiation. We're also at pains to say, I think, several times in the report that what we say is illustrative, because all of these questions would be resolved by negotiation, as would happen. And there are a few examples, some of which Craig has mentioned about how that happened. So, again, we say this is what we think a reasonable position would be to illustrate what would happen in the event of. And just interestingly, one of the reasons that Fraser Valander, for example, is so happy to say GERS tells us very little about the long-term finances of an independent Scotland is because it doesn't begin to do any of this.
Yeah.
Right? It talks about now, and our assumptions now about who owns what it's worth. It doesn't talk about any of the actual allocation of assets. First of all, knowing what they are.
Yeah, we don't know.
UK doesn't have an asset register that's nearly good enough to do this.
Yeah.
Right? There's a task, first of all, and then secondly, even if you've got that, you've got to work out what the valuations are, and then have a negotiation about who owns what, or who wants what in a trade. And all of these things would happen. Okay, so we put some pragmatic views about this stuff in the report to say this is the kind of thing we'd expect to happen, but it's all about negotiation. Financial regulation is also about that. So we're also quite clear throughout the report that this is a transition that needs to be managed. So we need to have strong, credible institutions with strong, credible experts, with strong, credible international experience running the new institutions to make sure that we're focused on growing the economy and giving us the right to earn better choices. That inevitably starts with, on day one, where we are, and then democratically changing it as we move forward. And it also reminds me that I didn't get a chance to answer about the international aid question that was raised at the beginning. We said that because we thought it was imperative to say that under no circumstances would Scotland default on its international obligations. And those of you who are watching the Brexit crisis unfold will see every day that signals in negotiations are really important. And so actually the reason we say that is to put absolutely beyond doubt that Scotland would not continue to meet its international obligations on international aid. Okay, so that's why it's there. So the critique about, well, would we want to think about that and would we want to have some say over any of the shared services is of course correct. But we thought it was very important to say that there's absolutely no way that we'd go looking to stop meeting our UN obligations on day one because we wouldn't have the infrastructure to spend the money and to put that beyond doubt. Great.
Donald.
David's point about trying to have simple arguments to put across to people so that we can earn their trust that this is the right thing for our country. And one of these, I would say, simple arguments that maybe I don't see often enough that I think is really important, and one of the reasons why I believe that Scotland should be independent is because the UK has got a built-in unfair competition between the market for the largest player, which is England, you've got to say it, and Scotland, so that when choices, decisions are made in an economic way, Scotland loses out on that. They have to. Scotland has to lose out, because the people who run the UK are looking after the interests of, what, 60 million people. They're going to do that first. They have to do that first. You're talking about the USSR, and they, under the USSR, all the satellite bits before they broke off, they were under the USSR, but after, they could thrive because they were out of that competition. Within that competition, Russia looked after Russia. It had to, because if it didn't, if it put all its eggs in one basket to look after, I don't know, the state of Lithuania, then they'll be rioting in the street in Moscow and say, well, what the hell are you doing? So the UK has, as far as I can see, got, well, as far as everybody can probably see, but I think it has to be highlighted more. I think it's a legitimate argument to make to people that we're in an unfair competitive arrangement, and independence takes away that, gives us a chance to redress that balance. That's my, there you go.
It's really important to say, though, that those people in Whitehall don't look after most people in England either. Right? Because it's not about England, it's about London and the South East. And we say that in the report time after time after time. We've got one region which is too big to fail. And the implications of that for what happened in all the other parts of the UK are really, really profound. And what was interesting over the last year was to watch some of the reactions to the ONS experimental statistics on regional deficits. And people in the London media in particular, who should know better, frankly, were astounded about the performance of parts of England. And depending on which boundaries you use, you can find substantial parts of England outside the South East which is now demonstrably poorer than most of the ex-communist 2004 accession states. Right? And that's just unbelievably shocking state of affairs. And there's a graph, I think, which came from The Economist originally, which we reproduce about the scale of regional inequality in major economies. And the UK is, unbelievably different from most of the other major economies in Europe. So you're absolutely right, but again, let's think about what's really happening, and it's London and the South East that's privileged, not England per se. And there are all kinds of second-order effects about that. So one of the things that I'm doing in my research life at the minute is thinking about how we really get a realistic productivity uplift in Scotland. One of the things that we don't have is enough people with experience of senior managerial positions, because they're all in London. And they don't want to come back because of the way the housing market works, because it's managed for the London economy. And so there are so many of these second-order policy things that never get into the consciousness that affect the Scottish and other regions in the UK's economic health every single day. But in general terms, you're absolutely right, because I don't think that's understood in general discourse at all.
I saw in ITN something that I found really very surprising, that they were putting this out, that the expenditure on infrastructure in London and the South East was something like £4,500 per head, whereas in the North, and they just said the North, so I don't know whether that included Scotland or not, it was £2,500. In other words, there was a subsidy in effect of £2,000 per head going to the London and the South East.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So a lot of my research background is in transport mobility and how that shapes where the economy is and how it functions, and then the impacts of that. So let's leave aside the issue of whether High Speed 2 is a good thing per se, right? But it's really interesting if you go to a meeting in Manchester about High Speed 2. So all the government rhetoric is going to be about how this is going to rebalance the economy and transform the north of England. The GDP gap between the three economic regions of the north and the southeast is something like 120 billion per year, from memory. Like, there's absolutely no way that any infrastructure project ever can make a dent in that. It's just nonsense. But then if you take the train back down to London and you go to a meeting about High Speed 2, what is the discussion about? There's so many people going to be pouring off the train in London and we must spend 30 billion on Crossrail 2 to cope with them. And I've heard, you know, the same government ministers saying these things in different places. And you think we've generated this intense core periphery political economy that then makes these absolutely insane decisions that keep, you know, make the crisis deeper. And frankly, that's why we ended up with Brexit. We've ended up with Brexit because the north of England was ignored for 20 or 30 years, and some of the level of inequality and social deprivation, particularly in the small towns of the north of England, is eye-popping. And I say that as someone who's spent a research career that's not exactly been disconnected with inequality in Glasgow and the west of Scotland. You know, but if you go to some of these communities in the north of England, you know, you can see just what a bad deal they get. So let's not talk about England. Let's talk about London and the South East, because that's what it's all about.
Yeah. It's one thing that Britain is also really, really bad at doing is comparing itself properly to other nations. Iain alluded to the graph in The Economist that shows regional inequality. If we'd been doing a PowerPoint presentation tonight, I would have flooded you with graphs, because to me, happiness is a well-formatted spreadsheet. I'm sad that one. There's a really good, that one in The Economist, and there's a similar one on Eurostat that shows the regional inequality across the EU 28. Right? In most European countries, the capital city is the richest region in the country. That's normal, money flows to power. Okay? In most European countries, the GDP per capita of the capital city is about 200%, 2 times more than the national average. The UK, London, is more like 700%. It's off the scale. Actually, literally off the scale. The original graph of The Economist had to get cut off to make it fit on the page. So yeah, the UK is weird when you look at it compared to any other remotely comparable nation, and that's something we do not say loud enough or often enough.
It's a difficult message to sell, though, actually, because one of the other things that's important to realise is that if you take away London and the South East from these statistics, then Scotland often appears as the best performing UK economic region in many metrics. Okay,
that's
because it is, but we need to think about why that's the case. Part of it is because we've already got, and I've had, not just since devolution, but before that, a set of institutions that are actually quite good at making decisions. You know, and I do a lot of work in the north of England in transport and regional development and other things, and they would love to have the institutional expertise and the experts that we've got, and some of the achievements of what we've done in particular economic sectors in regeneration. You know, absolutely nothing is perfect, but we've done some pretty good stuff. Actually, we're quite good at this.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that whenever you hear that Scotland is below the UK average in whatever metric you choose, quite often we're still the third best region after London and the South East, which just shows you how big that skew is.
Thanks. So before I get to my question, guys, Iain, I'm interested briefly in your take on what I do when I'm in London. Every time I go off the tube station, I look around me and say, so this is where you spent all the oil money, right? Because I see the imbalance when you're down there all the time. And their travel infrastructure is incredible. They all complain about it, but it's incredible. My question was, when it comes to macroeconomics, I'm not educated enough and intelligent enough to really follow the nuts and bolts. So I tend to pick my champions and align myself with what they say. My champions on economics are Mark Blythe and Yanis Varoufakis. Has either of them ever had the chance to look at the report? Because they probably haven't, but if they have, do we know what their opinions would be? Maybe that won't be valid, but what do you guys know?
That's the second time I'm going to have to say I don't know. I don't know. Well, you know, we published it. You can take the horse to water, but you can't. Yanis Varoufakis is in Edinburgh for the book festival this week, and I've seen a little video clip where he kind of eventually got to the right conclusion, I think, at the end of what he was saying in response to a question. I don't know. That's a good challenge. I mean, I should be a bit cheeky and say something about the reaction to the report and the critique. It's been a couple of really good critiques. I like John McLaren's stuff a lot of respect for John. You know, he comes from a position where he knows how the Treasury works and he knows how UK governments work, and he's he says some good stuff in his response, actually, and we've taken that on board, and it's interesting to think about. You know, other people that take 25-year-long point forecasts and then immediately extrapolate to fantastic statistical accuracy, something which is, you know, precise but meaningless, is slightly different. There's a great quote which I saw bandied about on Twitter today from the boss, principal of Glasgow University, trying to work out who it was. It said, "A trend is a trend is a trend until it isn't."
Yeah.
You know, another debate we mustn't get dragged into is the fact that it's going to be like that tomorrow because it was yesterday. You know, just imagine we're having this conversation in 1980s Ireland, and somebody is brought into Dr. Fitzgerald at Taoiseach's office to say, "Well, I'm sorry, you know, nothing's going to happen in Ireland the next 25 years because here's the trend line, folks." You know? The whole point is you get the institutions right, you get the right people in there, they make the right decision, and stuff happens.
I remember talking to a currency speculator once who gave me a bit of sage advice, and he said, if you ever meet someone who claims that they can accurately and reliably predict the market, they are lying, because if they could, there wouldn't be a market because they would have all the money.
Is it Keynes' quote that the purpose of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable? You know, so it's important that all of us, even those of us who write reports about the economic future, sometimes you take a step back and you say, you know what, if the world is uncertain. And again, that's something we're keen to say about the report. We've set out what we think is a pragmatic pathway that's a reference point. We're not saying that necessarily it's going to be like that, but it's a well-argued, I hope, reference.
Another one I like as an economist's job is to tell you tomorrow why his projection yesterday didn't come true today.
Anyway, enough economist bash.
You mentioned currency speculators there, and what's happening in Turkey at the moment. Donald Trump suddenly takes the hump against them, and it's cost them a lot. He doesn't particularly like Scotland either. So, of the two systems, what would be the best to negate speculation? I mean, we've seen Farage and such like allegedly making money on the Brexit decision. So
that's a read both reports and you pays your money, you take your choice question.
Yeah.
So for us, we kind of think that's a real risk, and we think that's absolutely why you get the fundamentals of the economy right, and you do something to improve growth, performance, and have all the institutions in place and have that track record and meet the tests before you make the move. You know, that's a particular risk appetite, to use the jargon. Craig's paper puts another perspective, which has a different perspective on risk about that. We argue that our view of the world is correct, and you'd argue that yours, but you know, he takes your money, pays your money, he takes your choice in that one. And that's a democratic choice. That's what it's all about. So what do we think about the risks and opportunities, and how much risk are we prepared to take? And I would say, let's be cautious, because we've got to convince people it's worth the effort to get from there to there.
One of the things in Turkey's particular case is they took on a lot of debt in dollars, which left them vulnerable to the dollar market. Last year we saw Denmark pay off all of its foreign denominated debt, so it wouldn't have that problem. So I'm reminded of a speech by the then governor of New Zealand's central bank in the year 2000, when he said, ultimately, when it comes down to all these choices, because they were considering, you know, taking their free floated currency and then pegging it again to the US dollar or the Australian dollar, he said, ultimately, yes, there are risks in everything you do with currency. They're often different risks rather than greater or lesser ones. They have different ways of managing them rather than greater or lesser ones. It's how you're prepared to do it. It is how you get the institutions set up to deal with them. It might require different institutions to deal with different choices. So yeah, you pick your option and you build towards it.
And part of the reason that in the report we talk about Denmark and Finland and New Zealand, we don't do that for the reasons that people have told us we picked them, which of course is an interesting commentary in the debate itself, but these are places that have had problems, and they've made really interesting policy choices to get out of them. You know, and they're small countries, and they've had to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, but they made it work. And we need to look at these places really carefully. You know, we think of Denmark today as this, you know, ludicrous runaway success story. You go back to the mid-1980s and what was happening, particularly when the urban economy in Copenhagen was collapsing about its ears, the Danish government was not happy. And they did not think the future was very bright, and they took a series of quite hard decisions on a kind of nuts and bolts policy level about what industries they were going to support, how they were going to change enterprise policy, back down to how the welfare system worked and the kind of flex security idea that they developed then, because their economy was not all that healthy and they were worried about it. You know, these places have made really good choices, because that's what you can do if you've got the power and the ability to take them, and you get them right, obviously.
Maybe we should make this the last question, or something, unless there's people who desperately wanted to come in. It's quite. I found this quite dense, not dense in the sense of thick.
Rich.
I mean, quite rich. Rich. That's the word. Rich. A euphemism. Yeah. Sorry.
The potential for an innovative, integrated, and free public transport system. You're a transport guy. Estonia, I think, are doing things like this. I've heard Sheffield had it for a little while. What kind of things, what kind of impact could that have on a future Scotland?
The sad, boring and dramatic answer is that it couldn't cope with demand, and it killed the railway overnight. So the places that managed to do it are because they've got a completely different structure of how people move around. The base point is different. What's more interesting is the way that a lot of places that look kind of like Scotland, so the German Länder and the cities within them that look a bit like the Glasgow conurbation, have moved towards a much more, not free, but a few of them have got this idea of €1 per day. So, you know, a yearly season ticket costs €365. But again, this is, so I bore you all night about transport-related issues, but this is a great example of the world as we wish it to be and how we find it. It would be really nice to get there, and it would create all kinds of social and environmental and economic benefits to occur. But we've got this very expensive system that's managed in a particular way, and we're going to have to do things one by one to change it into what we want. So yes, please, but don't underestimate how much it would cost and how difficult it would actually be to do.
We don't even have the right gauge of railways to have the big double-decker trains that we have in Europe. Sorry, my family, I come from a family of railway engineers, so I'm a bit like this as well. Yeah, we are, Commonweal published a paper last year sort of trying to get us towards a public option in the railway franchise, which I'm glad the Scottish Government's sort of moving towards that now. We're wanting to do more research on the integrated side, so you know, there's nothing more frustrating than stepping off a train to see your bus drive away. So I want to get the different modes of transport working better. But you need to look deeper into your economic policy as well. Why are you commuting in the first place? You know, we've set up our society so that we've got our residential dormitory villages and towns here and all the jobs over there. Can we mix that up a bit more and get people a bit closer to where they want to work? That's a very long-term project. This is lifetimes of work.
One of the other things I'm doing at the moment is to be a member of the Glasgow Connectivity Commission that the City Council set up to look at some of these things, and might be about to reveal a state secret, but because we haven't published the report yet, it's due in November, but we will say stuff that's kind of like, it would be nice if we had more population growth in the city centre, so that we could do things that didn't require lots of expensive infrastructure investment, because obviously that's money we're not spending on other things like schools and training and childcare and all the rest of it. It is of course incumbent on me as declare my interest the non-exec director on the board of ScotRail. They all hate me for that if you didn't know before, didn't you? The average private train company in the UK makes a margin of profit of between 2.5% and 3%, and most research, and even the government's own research that's done about the nationalised 100% publicly owned infrastructure company says it's more than 30% efficient. So let's make sure that we fix the problem rather than running to the solution that makes us feel better.
Okay, I think that's it for tonight. It remains for me to thank Dr. Craig Dalzell. I think I probably called you DL, did I?
Yes, DL, it should be.
Should? Oh, well, there you go.
7 letters, middle 5 are silent.
And Professor Iain Docherty, or is it Iain? I think, can I thank you both? You've remained very civil, I must say. I expected maybe there would be a breakdown in good relations, but no, there wasn't. And thank you for the questions, and thank you for turning out in such a large number, in large numbers. And a night that wasn't very promising, I have to say. Some of you got soaked in the way in, I think. Okay, can I ask people that they leave by that door over there? The reason for that is we're going to have somebody with a bucket collecting money. If any of you have money. We can't have a currency. We can't have a currency.
Any currency accepted.
Debate in inverted commas without money. Okay, thank you very much.
Folks, just like to make an announcement, right? We're doing a crowdfunder, so if you can help us out, it'd be greatly appreciated. We do these every 4 months, and it keeps one person full-time in Independence Live, and somebody donated us an office down in Tradeston. Okay, so we can do all this stuff with the support that we get. Okay, and we've got a group in Edinburgh, Petershead, Aberdeen, Glasgow. So if you can help us out, go to independencelive.net. We've also got a little table up there with badges and stuff. Feel free to grab one, okay?
Oh yes, that's right. That's right.
Yes, that's the short answer.
Is that not the promotion then? No, I've never seen it either. That was cool again. No, thoroughly enjoyed it. Right, you got the no Davis number. But Jared Scotland yes. It was right, that would be great. Oh no, that would be really, really interesting, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm an academic, I'm happy to sing it unless I really think something about it. You know, I don't know so we'll wait on
Okay folks, we've got Dunfermline March and Rally coming up on, I think it's the 1st of September, and we're covering Edinburgh as well. Just check out our website, independencelive.net, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter, okay? So when we go live, you can share those links, right? So hope you enjoyed tonight, and see you again soon. Bye now.
It's going to do is that the union's all the thing that